Okay, so as I watched the downfall of HBO Max due to capitalistic greed, and right before I throw myself into the business end of a wood chipper head first for choosing to constantly talk about it, let's have some fun and talk about Edge. More specifically, edgy characters. You know them, you pretend to hate them even though realistically a good chunk of you probably loves them. Now, there's no shame there, I love edgy characters. There's just something about a character who doesn't care for the rules or anyone in particular that makes them fun to watch. But that being said, it's very easy for an edgy character to wear out its welcome quite fast, and it's not hard to see why. When an edge character is done right, they present a challenge to the norms of whatever you're viewing. But if they're bad, you're stuck sitting through an hour-long slog about how the hero just doesn't understand the true meaning of the world and that this is the way it must be. You know, the fact that I said that and realistically anyone watching this probably imagined a particular character really says a lot. So to get to the main question, what makes a good edgy character? And that's what I want to try and find out today. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your host Alexander, and I'm actually really excited to talk about this. It's sort of a triple whammy for me. I can talk about games, comics, and cartoons all at once. And we'll be tackling all three of those genres because edgy characters are everywhere. Like I said, chances are the person watching this right now has a favorite character that is, by definition, kind of an edgelord. And odds are I'll probably cover them. And just for fun, we'll be starting at the best of the best and moving on to the worst of the worst. Think of it like a reverse iceberg. The stuff in the deep is the best, while that tiny little piece at the top is the shallowest and the worst. But first, and I never thought I would have to do this, but content warning. And I want to put this out there right now that there is no shame in backing away now. It will get gruesome, and it will probably get a little weird. Anyway, this video will contain graphic descriptions of sexual harassment, racism, the neo-Nazi ideology, homophobia, murder, child molestation, child pornography, rape, cannibalism, infanticide via cannibalism, sexual assault to a human skull, animal molestation, genocide, and the sexual assault of the mentally handicapped. None of what I just read was a joke, and I refuse to show any of that. The less people see of that, the better. Oh, and there are also some slight spoilers for Persona 5. But yeah, if any of what I just said sounds horrific enough to click off, feel free. Last chance here. Okay? We all good? Alright then, with all that being said, let's raise the curtain and set the stage. Okay, so let's start with the best of the best and talk about what I call perfected edge. Now these are the characters whose edginess actually make the comic, show, or anime they're in better. So think characters like Akechi, Red Hood, All For One / Shigaraki, and Vegeta. All these characters are what could be considered perfected edge. Their edge isn't harmful to the stories and in most cases actually helps it by showing a contradictory viewpoint to the main character. Characters like Vegeta and Akechi are the biggest examples of this. With Akechi, you're shown the life Joker would have had if he had allowed himself to be absorbed into all the malice and aggression that followed after he had been arrested, instead of trying to develop friendships and seek true justice. And Vegeta serves as an obvious parallel to Goku's life, at least in the first two arcs. But the parallel was still there. Where Goku enjoyed fighting just to better himself and enjoy his family, Vegeta fought to kill and pretty much killed anyone not useful to him. And yes, I realize I'm explaining Dragon Ball to YouTube, and yes, it's redundant, but I want to cover all my bases, and for a lot of people, Vegeta is the original Edge character. And nearly every iconic moment he had after the Saiyan and Namek saga was only so iconic because of the edge he had when he first appeared. Him sacrificing himself to stop Buu only felt so impactful because we saw that growth from bloodthirsty monster into something more human. And that's important because both Red Hood and Shigaraki are more refined parallels to what Akechi and Vegeta are. Both Shigaraki and Akechi serve as foils to the protagonists of their games and anime, but what makes Shigaraki so much more refined with his edge is the fact that it's a driving force. And I want to make it clear, when I say edge or edgelord, I'm not using it in an insulting way. Despite the negative connotation it has, edge characters can and should be used. They just have to be used well. And what makes Shigaraki so impressive is that he's a perfect example of the idea of edginess being used to push the story forward without having it go over the top. Every part of Shigaraki that you would even consider being in the realm of edgy is due to the Hero Society. You know, minus the mass murder. But his outfit, his personality, and his goals are all direct repercussions of the Hero Society that failed him. And Red Hood is technically the same. And again, I do want to settle something I feel is going to end up being a point of contention. Technically speaking, yes, Red Hood should be on the lower level quality of edge. But the thing is that before he was given terrible writer after terrible writer, Under the Red Hood was considered one of the better Batman stories. And the movie is still regarded as one of the best DC animated movies ever. And for a good reason. The entire movie is tight, concise, and filled with memorable voice actors. But it's Red Hood who sells this movie. Like Shigaraki, you start to feel for Red Hood the more you watch the movie. His actions aren't justified, but they're not really supposed to be. Red Hood isn't looking for justification for his actions, he's looking for an explanation. The entire climax of the movie isn't about killing Joker and getting revenge on Batman, it's about his son trying to rationalize why he wasn't good enough for his father. Even in the speech he gives to Bruce, you can hear his voice waver.
You know, I thought I'd be the last person you'd ever let him hurt. If it had been you that he'd beat to a bloody pulp, if he had taken you from this world, I would have done nothing but search the planet for this pathetic pile of evil death-worshipping garbage and send him off to hell.
He wants to know why Batman didn't seem fazed by his death. And the thing is, as a viewer, we know that Bruce built an entire shrine to honor him, but for someone just back from the dead, he never saw Bruce really grieve in any way. So he forces him to confront him by making him face all his past mistakes. Is it over the top and edgy as hell? Yeah. But like Akechi, Shigaraki, and Vegeta, it works because the story complements it. Akechi, Red Hood, and Shigaraki work as edge characters because they're meant to show the darker side of what either the world they live in is or what the hero could potentially end up as. And Vegeta works because he's an example of what Goku should have been. They complement the story, and in return the story complements them. But with that being said, we can move on up to the middle. And I call this level the dulled edge. This is the spot for edge characters who could have almost worked, but due to either being forgotten or mismanaged in their media, never really got the final piece to really hone and refine them. So here you end up with characters like Reaper, Revenant, and Shadow the Hedgehog. And for Reaper and Revenant, their main issue comes from the fact that both Blizzard and EA prefer to drip feed lore. And since both companies tend to retcon things, it becomes hard to say what's really canon and what's not. Though I will give EA credit here, for the most part Revenant's lore is kept pretty consistent and he does fit well in his world. Design-wise, he's simple yet effective, but his in-game reactions are where he shines. Now earlier I said that the perfected edge characters are the ones who present a new perspective for the story. But when you have a game like Apex where the story takes a back seat, the best thing an edge character can do is either be intimidating or comedic. And Revenant does both in-game. Revenant's interactions in Apex are a perfect example of how to create an edge character that doesn't dip too far into annoyance. His voice lines are edgy and usually revolve around death and murder, but they work so well because 1, they're usually in some way a sarcastic jab at whoever he's talking to, and 2, no one in Apex really cares. Almost everyone in Apex is killed at least once, so the idea of a murder bot sprinting at them with a gun doesn't faze them. At best they hate him, and at worst they're annoyed by him. Except Mirage. Mirage might be scared of Revenant, but even then it's kind of vague because of the way Mirage talks. As for everyone else, it's no big deal with Revenant. Though the same can't be said for Reaper. See, while both games have dialogue that gives lore to the characters through interactions with another, I can't really give Reaper any real credit since again, most of the stuff that's said in-game is usually contradictory to what's actually canon. So because of the massive rewrites and retcons, it takes a character with a story that could potentially have something going for him and leaves him in this middle ground of mediocrity. But now let's move on and talk about Shadow. And this one hurts, because Shadow should be in the lower tier with all the nearly other perfect edge characters. His story was nearly perfect, and while he was a little over the top with his edge, he always had this misunderstood anti-hero angle to him that just made you kind of like him. But the reason he's in this tier and someone like Red Hood is in the lower one is because over the past years, Red Hood has gotten comic runs that improve his character and build off the original idea that Under the Red Hood had. Whereas Shadow has only gotten progressively worse every time he makes an appearance. Now this is mainly due to the fact that there are technically 2 versions of Shadow. The first is the more popular video game version that everyone thinks of regarding the character, but the second one is the Archie Comics Shadow, and that's the main issue here. Juggling a character's personality between 2 separate continuities is hard enough. But when it comes to edge characters, for some reason it always comes off as borderline impossible. And that's mainly because each writer in charge of each continuity wants something different for the character. The video game writers want to show Shadow as this loner type struggling to find his place in the world, while the comics try to make him more of a Vegeta archetype to Sonic. Then the later games try to incorporate that idea into their Shadow, and in the end we're stuck with a middle-of-the-road mess that doesn't know what to do with itself. The funny thing is, had they kept Shadow with Rouge and Omega in the later games, it probably would have worked a lot better. Their personalities blended well in Sonic Heroes, and it felt like Shadow was more developed. Plus they could have done a whole Justice League Legion of Doom thing where everyone has their own enemy to fight. But in the end, Shadow ends up right in the middle due to corporate decisions. And in case you're wondering, I'm not going to talk about Sonic Frontiers because 1, it's not out yet, and 2, going by the leaks, Shadow's not in it anyway. But we can move on and finally talk about the very tip top. The shallowest of the shallow and the worst examples of edge, which I call dull edge or pointless edge. And there's 2 here that I want to talk about, but they both have the same problem, so I'll just kind of switch between them. But the main one here is The Boys. Now, just to clarify, I'm talking about the actual comic, The Boys. While the Amazon show can at times be edgy, it's never quite as bad as the comic it's based off, and at times can serve an actual purpose. The comic, on the other hand, is a whole other mess in and of itself. And I'm not going to cover the entirety of the story, mainly because it's a nightmare, but just know that when I made that trigger warning at the very beginning, I made it specifically for this comic, because it is a masterclass in how to fumble with edge characters and satire as a whole. And the worst part is, on the surface, I can see what The Boys was trying to be. It was meant to serve as a criticism of how the concept of heroes could be exploited and how anyone with that type of power could potentially end up corrupted by it. The idea itself is generic but solid and could be a pretty interesting thought experiment. The issue is that it's buried under so much edge you would have to read the entire comic run 4 to 5 times just to try and make sense of it. And honestly, the problem isn't that the book is edgy. Like I've been saying, edge can work, but there's a very strong difference between edge and unnecessary edge. All the stuff you see in the Amazon version of The Boys is edge, but it works because it contributes to the overarching story the writers are trying to tell. The edge in the comic doesn't work because it serves no real purpose. The first rape scene the comic does is meant to provide you with a knowledge of how disturbed the heroes act, and it does that really well. The same thing could be said for the murders. But the thing is, every subsequent time you see these things, they lose their impact. It goes from a horrific look at how people with power can believe they can get away with anything, and then turns into a slightly worse episode of Ren and Stimpy adult party cartoon. And after a while, it all just starts to blend together. I didn't care that a superhero was secretly a Nazi because 2 issues earlier I just saw a guy get sodomized by a dog. Then after that, I had to learn that the Supes are molesting children. Then after that, I had to read a scene of Homelander having sex with the Vice President's skull. It felt like the comic was trying to one-up itself when no one really asked it to. We knew that the heroes were bad. We didn't need a constant reminder every issue. The same issue exists in a lesser extent in Injustice. The writers made it hard to feel for Superman once you see him laser a child through the skull. Again, the idea for both of these could work, but the story needs to be front and center first. A better example of a comic like this would be Irredeemable. It still has the overly used edgy theme of what would happen if Superman was evil, but it's tempered by the fact that we're given the story of what drove the Plutonian to end up on this path. It does the opposite of The Boys. The story comes first, and then it's complemented with the violence and edge so it doesn't overwhelm you. It all just blends together into a cohesive comic. And really, that's the main point with Edge. It should be the salt to the meal of the story. A pinch can make something better, a small handful can be a bit overpowering, but if it's managed right, it can be fine. But when you're just dumping salt shaker after salt shaker into the meal, you're not making anything better, just everything around you worse. Red Hood and Shigaraki work because while they're mainstays in their respective franchises, they're usually restrained or given other characters to bounce off of. Shigaraki has the League of Villains, and Red Hood has the Outlaws or the Bat Family. Reaper, Revenant, and Shadow almost get there, but they're held back by companies that can't figure out how to handle them. But with comics like Injustice and The Boys, you just end up getting exhausted trying to deal with it. So when it comes down to the question of what makes a good Edge character, it really comes down to knowing what you want to do with them. Otherwise, they kind of just end up existing, or worse, they end up dragging the entire story down because they're just there for shock value. Edge characters, like every other character, need a purpose, and arguably they need it more because edgy characters tend to stand out far more than regular ones. So when you have a comic like The Boys that keeps trying to out-edge itself, you just sit there wondering why you're wasting your time. It's a delicate balance for edge characters, but I also think that's what makes them so fun, provided you know how to actually write them. But I think that's going to be the curtain call for this video. I might end up coming back to do more of these types of analysis on character types. I do have one planned for villains that might be out later this month depending on things, and I also still have some more cartoon reviews I want to take care of. But as always, with the current closing, I'll leave you with some questions. What are your thoughts on Edge characters, and where do you put your favorite on the list? Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content. Until next time, I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.